Good morning. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to read this paper because I can't remember all this. We thank you for the invitation to participate in this session and the opportunity to share our views with you today. I'm Kurt Dongoske, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Zuni Tribe, a position I've enjoyed for the past 14 years. The trajectory, content, and substance of this presentation was developed in partnership with Edward Wimatewa and Dr. Giorgio Curti. Mr. Wimatewa is a Zuni traditional bearer for biocultural diversity, who has been twice elected to the Tribal Council. In an act of decolonization in 2010, Mr. Wimatewa refused the Catholic oath, which was the means of being sworn into the elected Zuni Tribal Council seat, and was removed by other Tribal Council members who had requested the Catholic oath. Dr. Curti is a social cultural geographer and a critical geoethnographer who works with and for the interests of the Zuni tribe and Zuni people, and serves as an adjunct professor and lecturer in the Department of Geography at the San Diego State University. It is our collective understanding that the reason we were invited here today was to offer a productive and pragmatic pathway to advancing solutions for the San Francisco Peaks traditional cultural property. We anticipate that our talk here today may be perplexing to some, and that is okay. As a very wise man, Khalil Gibran, once said, perplexity is the beginning of knowledge. We also anticipate that our words and sentiments may bring offense to others. That is also okay, because shocks to thought are often necessary to bring about productive difference. At this point, we'd like to emphasize that we do not speak on behalf of the Pueblo of Zuni. That role is done by the duly elected leaders of the Zuni tribe, who are advised by the Zuni religious leadership. Our goal here today is to present and represent some of the interests of the Zuni tribe and the Zuni people with respect to the San Francisco Peaks. And learning from and echoing Audra Simpson, we do not consent to tell the internal story of Zuni struggle, but we do consent to telling the story of their constraint. Two thematic inquiries must be raised before we can continue with balanced spirit and in good conscience. The first is, what exactly is needed to be resolved regarding the San Francisco Peaks? Is it the enduring and aggregating effects of slow and swift violence born from the joint epistemological errors and epistemologies of mastery imposed by settler colonial governance and society on native peoples and native lands, airs, and waters, locally at the peaks and globally throughout the monstrous changes we are all experiencing through rapidly changing global climate? Is it how mainstream neoliberal capitalist gospels and proselytization of Western science continually converge and commingle, wherein the only pasts and futures that are considered are those that use science as an associate of colonial power, which, as Indian environmentalist and author Claude Alvarez has thoroughly documented, function not any less brazenly and effectively than colonialism extending hegemony by intimidation, propagation, catechism, and political force? Or is it how these epistemological errors, giving shape, form, and force to settler colonial governance, science, and society together, enduringly act as manifest ways of maintaining control, mastery, and ownership over all, to turn all into privatized and profitable products by usurping relational capacities and forces of and for life and lifeways, by sacrificing them at the altar of economic growth? Is it how all this is nothing more than a masked and veiled continuation of very specific and very detrimental lineage of Western Protestant Christianity? The second thematic inquiry is, what does the act of calling or considering the San Francisco Peaks a traditional cultural property, or TCP, actually accomplish? This term has no formal basis, weight, or force in U.S. law. Its designation offers no substantive protection in and of itself. It is also not, though there seems to be much lingering confusion about this fact at times, a property type eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Rather, TCP is a term coined in National Register Bulletin 38 guidance to suggest a form of significance that in legal and regulatory context corresponds for Native American tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to what 1992 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act call properties of traditional, religious, and cultural importance. 36 Code of Federal Regulation 804C1 states agency officials shall acknowledge that Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations possess special expertise in assessing the eligibility of historic properties that may possess religious and cultural significance to them. It is essential to remind those participating here today that this unique tribal special expertise in assessing eligibility involves both evaluations of historical significance and living traditional religious and cultural importance and assessments of integrity. Integrity being the capacity of a given property, place, or a landscape to continue to convey its significance to and for the Native community or communities for which it is important. By implication, this also includes what and how actions or activities may undermine or erode such integral capacities and integrities. For Ashiwi, the Zuni people and Zuni tribe, these integral capacities are co-relational, and the San Francisco Peaks is not a cultural resource to be managed or commodified, but familial life symbiotic with and essential to relational lifeways, capacities of stewardship, health, and well-being practiced through topographical and topological processes of movement, pause, and return. While such procedural imperatives to give good faith and reasonable considerations to such practices and processes while accounting for direct, indirect, and cumulative adverse effects to them under different legal and regulatory regimes, such as those of the NHPA and National Environmental Policy Act, are almost invariably and unabashedly violated by federal agencies through the U.S. judiciary any substantive promise, including those initially offered by the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and presumably the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, has been eroded and constrained through nascent and ultra-crepidarian pairing, distorting, manipulating, severing, alienating, and deforming in the interest of Western Protestantism norms and values. Here then we can clearly see how our two thematic inquiries converge, or if you prefer, emanate from the same errors that give life, drive, direction, purpose, and force to the preserving slow and swift settler colonial violence of science, governance, and society via interventions of Western property law that work in a manner that privilege the already powerful and continually violates the sovereignty of an indigenous people. Rebecca A. Sosi, Regents Professor at the James E. Rogers College of Law, the University of Arizona, and co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, has worked extensively to identify systemic operations and double standards at play in the privileging of Western knowledge systems and sciences over indigenous sciences and ways of knowing, and how these double standards in application manifest as coupled processes of epistemic and environmental injustices to indigenous people. She explains in this context that Western knowledge systems are typically built upon supposedly rationalist, secular epistemology that elevates the importance of science, economics, and technology. These forms of knowledge are seen as principled, fair, and neutral. In comparison, indigenous knowledge systems are often seen as deficient because they are perceived as faith-based religious systems or as the more primitive forms of cultural knowledge associated with tribal groups. Western knowledge systems, on the other hand, are seen as universally superior to those forms of local knowledge as a mechanism of understanding our world and developing policy innovations. In addition, the attribution of secularism conveniently disregards the Protestant Christian roots of Western European knowledge and attributes religiosity to less civilized cultures, including indigenous peoples. As such, dominant and domineering concepts of Western science, law, and property, whether within hegemonic knowledge regimes of private property or ultra-crepidarian considerations of traditional cultural property, are in need of wholesale ontological reformulation and epistemological reframing to advance an equitable solution to the settler colonial ills that infect the San Francisco Peaks locally, and Earth Mother globally. The method, tools, and techniques of settler colonial governments and governmentality and how they are advanced as much through coercion and willful self-disciplining and arrogant certainties of mainstream Western scientists, environmentalists, and non-governmental organizations, land managers, and supposed cultural resource specialists cannot, precisely because of their groundings in a fundamental epistemological error, advance any relationally productive solution for the proper treatment, care, and stewardship of the life and lifeways of the San Francisco Peaks, as their base assumptions and instincts are inseverable from Western Protestant Christian roots of severability, mastery, domination, and control of nature, and their essentializations and minimizations of Earth Mother as either a source of resource exploitation and monetary profit, instead of a relative for care and obligation, or as a place of recreation and leisure, rather than a sacred place of accountability and responsibility. While discourses of science and technology dominate, indeed, as the agenda and program for the 16th Biennial Conference of Science and Management of the Colorado Plateau and the Southwest region demonstrate, corrective attention must be given to how these discourses and narratives function as veils of a Western Protestant Christian ethos and ethology, often masked by supposedly value and faith-free statistics, measuring, cataloging, and other royal scientific means of identification, limitation, domination, and control. Importantly, these Western scientific discourses and narratives themselves cannot use their own scientific method, principles, logics, and ways of knowing and understanding the world to demonstrate claims of objectivity or neutrality. These are normative, not positive statements and claims, matters of value and faith which attempt to universalize partial and particular perspectives by privileging certain forms of rationality or methodology. They are discourses of knowledge and power designed to rationalize the domination and subordination that pave the way for the exploitation of people and nature. When uncritical and non-reflexive perspective statements and faith-based and value-laden claims underpin Western science and scientists, they invariably work in the service of settler colonial governance that depends on the reproduction and regeneration of epistemologies of mastery and control. These together depend for their success on the grievous sin of the Western mind, misplaced concreteness, the desire to absolutize what are but tenuous conclusions. These legacies are historically grounded in, determined by, and reproductions of early European Enlightenment era values, traditions, and opinions that, as global studies professor Walter A. Mignolo has demonstrated, give contingent historic rise to and socially entrenched a reorganization of knowledge that clearly stated that nature was there to be dominated by man. During this period before the Industrial Revolution, Western Christians asserted their control over knowledge about nature by disqualifying all coexisting and equally valid concepts of knowledge and by ignoring concepts that contradicted their own understanding of nature. At the same time, they engaged in an economy of brutal resource extraction for a new type of global market. Within this historically contingent process, anthropologist Gregory Bateson observed a half century ago, we can begin to see some of the epistemological fallacies of Occidental civilization. In accordance with the general climate of thinking in mid-19th century England, Darwin proposed a theory of natural selection and evolution in which the unit of survival was either the family line or the species or subspecies or something of the sort. But today, it is quite obvious that this is not the unit of survival in the real biological world. The unit of survival is organism plus environment. We are learning a bitter experience that an organism which destroys its environment destroys itself. The nonsense of the methods, concepts, sensibilities, and techniques of the Western science that seeks to advance remedies and solutions to the slow and swift violence of settler colonialism on native peoples and their lands, airs, and waters through approaches that are still have at their base legacies of ontological and epistemological errors of their Protestant Christian progenerations must be identified, named, and confronted. Most directly, we must, for any productive and actionable solutions for the peaks and any Native American TCP decolonize the privileged and entitled contradictions that endure through unceasing confusions of fictions of analysis that treat humans and nature, society and environment, people and place as distinct phenomena for reality. And there are many that endure. Again, we only need to look at the 16th Biennial Conference's agenda and program for evidence and examples. Such analyses are confusing methods for existence, the field for a laboratory. Here there is a universe of difference between Zuni science and dominant Western science. The former produces knowledge and wisdom through loving acts of relational communication. The latter extracts data and information through isolated and tortured confessions. As such, dominant Western science materially and spiritually functions as a reproductive, regenerative legacy in effect of Protestant Christian appetites and metabolisms, insatiable in both their need to master, control, consume, and commodify all of Earth Mother and all of her resources. The prior began for the supposed divine right and glory of crowning God, the latter for the unending need for consumption, growth, privatization of profit, and socialization for the altars of economics as religion called neoliberal capital. Because of this, dominant and dominating Western science cannot provide or advance any truly productive means to reformulate and reframe settler colonial hegemony. All that is done to erode the capacities for health, balance, and well-being of the San Francisco Peaks and the indigenous relational life and lifeways it supports and that support it. The logics of mainstream Western science used to hierarchically dominate, manage, and control rather than relationally and horizontally nurture, steward, care, and balance. Speaking in the context of the experience and treatment of black women in the United States, but equally relevant and applicable to Zuni people and all indigenous people of all genders, ages, and socioeconomic statuses, and other intersections of self-identification, Audre Lorde powerfully explains, those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, and they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. For Zunis and other indigenous people, persevering under the suffocating air and hegemonic weight of U.S. settler colonial governance, insistence that indigenous science, wisdom, and knowledge sovereignty reside and be filtered through the master's house upholds, promotes, and propagates, through mutual reinforcement, the mastery and control of Western science and law, and their predetermined outcomes that always work in the service of capital, privatization, and economic growth. And through these processes, they take on doubly articulated forms of slow and swift violence. Nixon explains slow violence as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed actions across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive, and spectacular in space, and is erupting into instant sensational visibility. Slow violence is instead a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. Such violence occurs both in terms of the doubly articulated local and global threats to viable Zuni futures as Zuni people, and to the unwinnable solutions imposed by double binds that impose on Zuni through refusals to consider or accept the validity and soundness of Zuni science, wisdom, and knowledge production outside limited and error-filled values and domains of the master's house. Kyle White has explained that as an environmental injustice, settler colonialism is a social process by which at least one society seeks to establish its own collective continuance at the expense of the collective continuance of one or more other societies, just one of its injustice-making features. Historically and today, there are many threats to collective continuance that are accidental and unavoidable, but settler colonial domination is not one of these threats. For indigenous people under settler colonialism, wrongful domination is locatable at the intersection of settler intent to undermine indigenous collective continuance and hence indigenous ecologies through disrupting the qualities of the relationships that are constitutive of collective continuance that facilitate social resilience or adaptive capacity. Settler colonial domination undermines social resiliency. Through misplaced confidence and highly partial knowledge schemes and other couplings of an ideology of manifest destiny that continues to be fueled by a sense of entitled racial and religious superiority maintained through networks and relations of power and privilege, various manifestations of slow, swift violence endure on Zuni through social, economic, and ecological operations and impositions of Western science law and their latent, although omnipresent, Protestant Christian foundation, a foundation that separates and isolates and mistakes labeling and identification for knowledge. An 1898 executive proclamation issued by President McKinley based on a recommendation from Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of forestry, established the San Francisco Mountain Forest Reserve. 6 years later, in 1897, the Forest Service Organic Act was passed, establishing the United States Forest Service and delegating to the federal executive branch the power to improve and protect the forests within the reservation for the use and necessities of citizens of the United States. Later, the San Francisco Reserve would be conjoined with lands from other nearby reserves to create Coconino National Forest by President Theodore Roosevelt on July 2, 1908. To give proper context to this, Isaac Cantor explains in his 2007 work, Ethnic Cleansing and America's Creation of National Parks. National parks do not preserve what the West was. They preserve a West which never was. The creation required a complete shift of the cultural paradigm of wilderness. The original national park was to preserve the western wilderness, complete as the earliest white explorers saw it. American Indian inhabitants were an important part of this vision. However, the great shift occurred and wilderness grew apart from humans in the view that the white Americans' preservation movement. In fact, American Indians in their subsistence use were seen as even less capable of appreciating nature than non-whites, justified, albeit poorly, by state-promoted manifest destiny. Indian tribes were sent to the reservation islands to die a slow death. Meanwhile, the national park became a potent symbol of natural beauty and national pride. Indian peoples did not, and they do not, consent to die. However, nor do they consent to lose the rights to national park lands. Here we see precisely how settler colonial law, science, and capital interests mutually embrace and reciprocally amplify at the San Francisco Peaks. Shortly after the creation of Coconino National Forest, recreational use, the sacred mountain by Euro-American skiers, began sometime in the 1930s. By 1935, a dirt road had been built by the Civilian Conservation Corps facilitating recreational skiing access, soon followed by the construction of a lodge by the Coconino Forest Service to accommodate larger crowds. In 1958, the Forest Service authorized the installation of a permanent ski lift in the San Francisco Peaks. I'm going to skip over some of this so that I can get to the end because I'm running out of time. To be okay with the commodification of the sacred San Francisco Peaks and the deleterious presence and activities of the snowball, to be of the mind that this simply needs to be better managed through scientific methods is not only to enable but to promote the ultimate privatization and commodification of all of Earth Mother, including any place important to you. There must be bravery on all of your parts to come to understand that while Native American traditional cultural landscapes, waterscapes are sacred, these geographical zones of sacredness and significance are not uniform. Rather, sacred geographies exist and as landscapes that are differentiated. Some places are more significant than others. Places differ in their use, functions, and meanings. The zone concept is part of advancement for solutions for San Francisco Peaks, and ATCP is essential, as it conveys a spatial differentiation and significance based on intensities of lived and living practices, relationships, activities, capacities, function, uses, and meanings over, in, through, and as space and time, rather than fixed, closed, isolated, siloed, linear, partitioned, or gridded mathematical and geometrical artificial containers of the spatial and the temporal born of the dominant and domineering Western mind, its enduring epistemologies of mastery and control, and entangled epistemological errors. On the part of Western scientists, environmentalists, non-governmental organizations, land managers, and supposed cultural resource specialists, coming to understand this fundamentally requires the overcoming of an all too prevalent ongoing cowardice of self-interest and refusal to respect that you do not have the right, the privilege, or even at times the ability to know. You must become worthy to know that you do not know and act and react accordingly. You must examine the errors and assumptions of your own foundations of thought and privilege, the very same errors that have brought all of us to the increasingly effects of industrial and colonial climate change. You must be worthy to confront how you have contributed to and continue to contribute to the slow and swift violence on San Francisco peaks, the Zuni people, and all Native peoples through your legacies of Western Protestant Christianity, veiled as science, law, private property, and their unfounded certainties, and attempting to define what it is that a TCP is and does. Decolonization must become an act in response to correct how you have privileged that knowledge, and which is partial as absolute, with little regard for the resulting direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. And I will stop there. Thank you.